So thank you guys for inviting me to speak at this workshop. I'm going to be talking to you about some of the discoveries or maybe undiscoveries and new questions and challenges, as well as some promising avenues for deep earth seismology. And let's just get started. So here's a compilation of recent tomographic models. These models reveal the large-scale structure inside the Earth. And if this just looks like craziness to you to show so many models, I feel the same way. There is a lot of there are a lot of tomographic models out there. They're telling us a lot about the Earth. And one of the challenges that we face is to extract information from these sets of tomographic models to decide what are reliably resolved structures and what features we can trust and which features are just an artifact of the way that the models are constructed. So for example, we can try to take all these models and sort out a distribution of slow and fast material in the lower mantle. And we can classify features across models to do this. So for example, we can ask the question, where do all the models agree? What is the consensus view of mantle structure from all these tomographic models? And you can ask that for faster than average regions shown on the left and for slower than average regions shown on the right. So here, this is just animating these guys so you can kind of see it from all these locations. And so we can then talk about what are the seismically fast structures and what are the seismically slow structures. Well, the seismically fast structures are slabs. That's pretty clear. There's an excellent correspondence between reconstructed locations of subduction zones and fast regions in the lower mantle. So here I show a figure that's kind of like a summary figure where in gray, I'm highlighting all the seismically fast regions in tomographic models in VP and in VS. And then on top of them, I overlay the reconstructed locations of subduction zones color-coded by age. And you can see that there's an excellent correspondence up to at least 140 million years, which is this green color. When you go to older subduction zones, it gets a little bit trickier. But this means that these tomographic models can inform essentially constructions of an atlas of the underworld, as Vandermeer so poetically put it. But the outstanding question is, how far back do we go? Is 130 million years the appropriate number, or is something like 240 million years an appropriate number? These kinds of studies can also reveal previously unknown slabs, like these fast regions here in the Pacific that have been interpreted by Ziglock and Michalniuk in the past to indicate intra-ocean subduction. But what about the slow regions? Well, the slow regions are perhaps a little bit more mysterious. We have these large-scale lower mantle low velocity regions known as large low shear velocity provinces, and there are still remaining questions about them. Are they compositionally distinct or not? Are they active as in plumes, or are they passive as in piles? Are they primordial, dating from the earliest times of Earth formation, or are they continually created and therefore potentially continually destroyed? And kind of the key to answering the question of whether or not they're compositionally distinct is whether the LLSVPs are denser than the surrounding mantle. If they are, then you can rule out this isochemical scenario in which they're the same composition as the surrounding material because they are hot, so they have to be buoyant. And so most seismic constraints do prefer dense LLSVPs, as do tidal constraints. But there is some room, kind of wiggle room. Stoneleigh modes, which are modes that are sensitive to the structure at the very base of the mantle, might not actually prefer dense LLSVPs, as pointed out by Paula Kohlemeyer in 2017. Although for interpreting these kinds of data, you really need to be doing full coupling calculations, which are not always done. And always there's a trade-off between CMB topography, the buoyancy of the upwelling plumes, presumably, that are co-located with these LLSVPs, and any kind of inherently dense core within them. And it turns out that sorting out what's going on the key to sorting out what's going on, in my opinion, is the morphology of these guys. So mapping the small scale structure within the LLSVPs is key for distinguishing between stable scenarios, so like piles, or dynamically unstable domes or plumes. And here I show a little cartoon from Wolf et al. 2015, where they show kind of what you expect for a shape for an dynamically unstable LLSVP and one that's dynamically stable. So this is essentially an intrinsically dense material, and this is one that's not as intrinsically dense. And in fact, this intrinsic density of the material will affect their morphology, whether you kind of subscribe to the idea that they are these continuous large-scale structures, or whether you think of them as clusters of thermochemical plumes, as recently proposed by Davai and Romanowitz. And here we see how, from that paper, we see kind of a series of images that show how plume morphology changes as the inherent density essentially of the plume material increases. So you can see that you start forming these kind of conical shapes for very dense compositional components. And so what can seismology do here? Well, waveform and array constraints can really help us nail down the morphology of LLSVPs. So for example, if we have a seismic wave, so this is a nice cartoon from Ward et al. 2020. If you have seismic waves that are kind of traveling up along an large low shear velocity province, and they are interacting with its edge, along the edge, you can have waves that are traveling through the anomaly and outside the anomaly, which can result in multiple arrivals through a phenomenon we call multipathing. And these arrivals can either be analyzed in the waveforms themselves, where you look at the complex shape or the broadened shape of these phases, or you can use array methods to detect multiple arrivals coming in with different slownesses, or rather with kind of different angles. So these pulse broadening studies have been carried out. So this is from a study of Zhao et al. And what they looked at is they looked at the S wave broadening across a fairly large data set. And so what they did is they looked at the shape of S waves, and they kind of figured out what the standard shape is for any given earthquake. And then they could figure out whether the S waves were narrowed or broadened with respect to this reference shape. And they defined a misfit here. So anytime on this figure right here, anytime you see a large triangle, that suggests a very broadened S waveform. And so when they mapped out these pulse broadenings or waveform broadenings back into the Earth to potential locations where they originated, they could essentially trace out this kind of a conical region beneath Hawaii, where the largest broadening was kind of seen at the edges of this conical region, although there's also some broadening in the center. And so this kind of is maybe reminiscent of the scenarios in which the material that makes up these slow regions is inherently dense. And in fact, if we look across the Pacific, if we look at these my favorite vote maps of what the global tomographic models give us, these vote maps also trace out kind of triangular or conical regions throughout the Pacific Basin. They're not super high. Sometimes they're only a couple of 100 kilometers high, but these conical morphologies really are reminiscent in my mind of something that is inherently dense, that's being shaped by upwelling above it. Okay, it turns out that the phenomena that give rise to the multipathing, to the pulse broadening, and to these multiple kind of waves that array methods can detect are related to how sharp the edges are of the structures we're investigating. And here by sharpness, we mean how much does shear velocity change in terms of percent per horizontal distance on the, let's say, core mantle boundary, if that's the region that we're studying. And so in the past, people have reported sharp lateral gradients on the order of between 1.5 and 6% change in shear wave speed per 100 kilometers. And these sharp lateral gradients have been interpreted to imply chemical heterogeneity. And there's really a wide literature on this. I'm just here citing a couple of kind of the earlier papers on this topic. And one question that I want to pose to this community is, can purely thermal gradients explain these velocity gradients? And here I show a figure from Davies et al. 2012, where they indicate that even in a purely thermal mantle convection scenario, so where there is no compositional heterogeneity, you can produce shear wave contrast of about 4% per 100 kilometers. And if that's the case, then the appearance of these multipath phases should perhaps not be interpreted as evidence for compositional heterogeneity in the lower mantle. Moreover, there are recent studies like this Ward et al. Study published this year that suggest that even smaller gradients, such as 0.7% VS change in 100 kilometers, which we suspect can be easily explained by purely thermal variations, might be sufficient to produce multipathing, at least on the data that they looked at, but perhaps not on all data. And so this is I think a promising area of further study and collaboration between geodynamics and seismology. So small-scale structure within the LLSVPs may yield other clues as to their origin and to their nature. And so seismologists can leverage various illumination geometries and seismic phases to probe this detailed structure. And here's a really compelling figure from a paper by Castle et al. In 2017, where they kind of target the African LLSVP and with a variety of different phases and geometries. So you can kind of, the point here is just to see how seismic waves traveling along different paths can provide constraints on the details of the structure within the African LLSVP. And one important thing to note is that when such detailed studies are carried out, they almost always find that the overall shear velocity drop is greater compared to global tomography. So this Castle study in particular found that there are abrupt differences in travel time between SKS and SKKS, just think a pair of phases, that reveal a 300-kilometer gap in the African LLSVP. And so this is the kind of cross-section that they studied, and they found a gap here in yellow. And so what does this gap represent? Does it represent an undulation of the LLSVP boundary? Or does it tell us that this is not a single coherent structure, but rather a structure composed of individual plumes, let's say? So that's one possible implication of this result. And I think, a way forward is to combine seismic constraints with geodynamic modeling of, in particular, the splitting and anisotropy, which tells us about flow around these regions, which should provide insight. So here we have a paper by Rice et al. In 2019. This is from Maureen Long's group, where they're looking at differences in splitting between phases that go through the LLSVP and those that go right outside it. And in this region where Castle finds a hole in the LLSVP, there are some kind of interesting anomalous signals. But let's talk about structure that's smaller scale than LLSVPs, and the kind of canonical small scale structure in the lowermost mantle are ULVZs, ultra low velocity zones. These are small, about 10 kilometers tall, about 100 kilometers across. They're dense, about 10% denser, and they're ultra slow, which means that the velocity decrease of VS is greater than 10%. There is a family of ULVZs that are called huge ULVZs, HULVZs, or mega ULVZs, which is mega ultra. It's kind of ridiculous, but it's meant to describe that these guys are about 1,000 kilometers across, so an order of magnitude larger than traditional ULVZs. And these have been discovered beneath Hawaii, beneath Samoa, Iceland, the Galapagos, and Marquesas Islands. And so one possibility is that these mega ULVZs represent locally thickened ULVZs from kind of a global layer of melt that's lying on the core mantle boundary. This is proposed by Jan and Romanowitz. So underneath plumes, where there's a mantle upwelling, you would kind of upwarp this melt layer, suck it up to a greater height. I know that this is an area of active study in geodynamics of about how high can you suck up such a melt layer and whether or not this is a realistic explanation. We also don't know whether these ULVZs are actually a solid state phenomenon. They could, for example, represent iron enrichment. We do seem to find an association between anomalous isotopic signatures of tungsten and helium, which are associated with the early Earth, and the presence of these mega ULVZs. And this is work by Mundell and collaborators. So how do we probe ULVZs as seismologists? Well, we can use a host of clever phases where we look at body waves that interact with the ULVZs in different ways. And in particular, I'm going to focus on this SPDKS phase. So if you have an S wave that's traveling along the in the mantle, this is the core, this is the mantle, that S phase will interact with, when it hits the core, if there's a ULVZ at the core, to produce a P wave that's traveling in the ULVZ, and that P wave can then be detected later at the surface. And this is a figure from Mike Thorne's recent work. And it turns out that what he did is he gathered a data set of more than 58,000 waveforms of SPDKS, which cover more than 50% of the CMB. This is the coverage of this data set. And what he looked for is complexity in these waveforms. So again, structural complexity will exhibit itself as complexity in the waveforms themselves. And using this method, he was able to discover new ULVZs or previously unknown ULVZs beneath North Africa, East Asia, and Papua New Guinea. So North Africa, East Asia, and Papua New Guinea. So that's exciting. Another way we can look for ULVZs is to look for S diffracted waves. So these are waves traveling along the core. As they pass through a ULVZ, the ULVZ will slow down that S wave and produce a very strong postcursor, or they can produce a very strong postcursor. And so by looking at the amplitude and the delay time of this postcursor with respect to the main S diff, we can figure out how large the ULVZ is and its properties. So how do we do this usually? Well, usually we would take a bunch of seismic data and arrange it according to some geometrical parameter like the azimuth or epicentral distance. So there's a figure from Kotar and Romanowitz where they oriented by azimuth, and they can see behind this main S-diff phase, they can see this post-cursor that comes in at later and later times as a function of azimuth. But if we can take a different look at this data. We can use this new technique called sequencing, which allows us to arrange seismogram in a way that maximizes similarity between them. So essentially you find an optimal arrangement. So for example, an optimal arrangement of these guys right here is the picture of Einstein. So you can imagine you take a piece of paper, you shred it, and then you find the optimal arrangement for the shreds of paper that allow you to glean some insights from this data. So by sequencing or finding this optimal arrangement of seismograms, we can contextualize and interpret signals even in poorly sampled regions where we don't have that azimuthal coverage to use traditional methods. And also it means that we can simultaneously analyze structures across a whole ocean basin or even globally. And this is a,
Ed, I
have
think
1
you
minute.
have, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what happens if we look at these postcursors across the Pacific? So we can get very wide coverage across the Pacific. Here are S-diff waveforms, if you just arrange them randomly. And then if you arrange them by the sequencer, you can see this population of waveforms where postcursors are detected. They're detected at about 40% of the waveforms. And in fact, there are only a few locations where these postcursors are completely absent, shown here in ochre. Whereas, and a few regions where they're exclusive. So all waveforms in these regions show postcursors. And then in most locations, about half the waveforms show these postcursors and half do not. So these pervasive postcursors that we found, so this is work of my postdoc, Doyeon Kim, recently published in Science. These pervasive postcursors don't show a amplitude reduction with increasing delay time, which tells us that they're distributed. So either these are edges of large-scale structures like LLSVPs or widespread scatterers in the CMB regions. And we also find evidence for this mega ULVZ underneath Marquesas, which I mentioned earlier. So there's a bright future. Recently, there's this amazing paper by Retailleau et al. In 2020, and they actually use noise correlations to detect PCP and P waves. So these are waves that can really tell us a lot about lower mantle structure. And this is really phenomenal work, or very exciting for me as a seismologist. Or we can use detailed studies of other kinds of phases to really map out structures at unprecedented detail. So this is a detailed model of the Hawaiian mega ULVZ by Jenny Jenkins et al., which is currently in review. So I'll just leave this slide up here. I guess my time's up. Thank you so much for your attention.